first session of the year, personality characteristics of effective remote workers. We've got a few people here. We're just waiting for some others to join. Before we'll get along with the introductions as well as some of the maneuvering around the app as we progress. So we're just going to give everybody a few more minutes to be able to join, and we'll kick it off. Just again, while we're waiting and you're not just looking at our pretty faces, there are options at the bottom of your screen that speak to chat. If you're having any questions or concerns or comments, please feel free to make them. I, as well as the administrator, will be looking through them. And feel free to interrupt. If you've got a question about what Jocelyn has to say, I'm more than happy to interrupt her and ask the question on your behalf. And again, a few slides in, there are going to be some polling questions, so please take part. So just as we're kicking off, it's 11:01. We'll just kind of give everybody another minute before we kick off. And again, just some of the housekeeping before we get started. There's a Q&A marker just below a chat session. If you have any questions, comments, or something you'd like me to ask Jocelyn, I'm more than happy to be able to do so on your behalf. All right, we continue to see people join the session, so we'll just give it just another minute, and we should be able to kick off at 11:03. And again, welcome to personality characteristics of an effective remote worker. All right, looks like we're about ready to be able to kick this off. Again, welcome everybody. We appreciate you taking time out of your day to be able to join us. And before we get kicked off, again, there's options at the bottom that allow you to be a part of our chat, that allow you to be able to ask questions. Feel free to ask at any time, and I'll be sure to interrupt Jocelyn during her presentation today to be able to voice your questions live. So I'm just going to take a minute to be able to introduce myself. My name is Jag Nidger. I am the Director of Sales here at DTEC. I work with organizations in the assessment lifecycle of employees. And I'm proud to have Jocelyn Hayes here, a consultant from Hogan Solutions. Not only has Jocelyn been working for Hogan for the last 8 years, she's been a practitioner for at least 15 before that, or sorry, 15 including that. She's got an MS in IO Psychology from Indiana University from Purdue. She's a chair of the IO division of the Association of Test Publishers, and a member of the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology. So very, very reputable. Thank you, Jocelyn. I appreciate you coming in and presenting this. And before I just send it off to you, just again, the housekeeping items. If anybody has live questions that they would like to ask, please ask at any time. And I'll be happy to interrupt Jocelyn. And make sure you take part in our polls. We'd love to be able to hear from you. Over to you, Jocelyn.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining today. Jag and the DTEC team has been kind enough to invite me to speak with you all on the effects of personality on remote worker effectiveness. This is a topic that I'm passionate about, both because I have spent my career working in talent assessment and most of my career working specifically in personality assessment. But also, I think it's a topic that kind of everybody is passionate about right now because of what has happened over the last year with the global pandemic and how that really has impacted both the prevalence of and the experience of remote working for employees and organizations. So our time together today, we're going to kind of go right down the agenda that you see on the screen here. We'll talk a little bit about the state of remote work. What does it look like? How many people are doing it? Where are we at now that we are nearly a year into the pandemic? Then we'll move our attention to some of the things that we find are related to success in a remote environment. So we'll look at some of the competencies that we know help a person be successful, and also some of the underlying personality characteristics that relate to those competencies. We will finish up our time together talking just about some kind of practical tips and tricks, regardless of your personality, your job, your location. We'll try to share some things that you can think about, that you can help your teams think about to be more effective in a remote environment. And then, of course, we'll save time at the end for questions. So I fully agree with Jag. If you have questions that are coming up as we go, don't hesitate to jot those down in our Q&A. If we get to the end and you think, oh, I have a question coming up now, we'll have time to address it then as well. So we're going to jump off with a poll question. Before I do any of my work, I'm going to ask you all to do a little bit of work. So if you could, you should see your poll on the screen there. And the question is, how frequently do you think you'll work remotely in 2021? So looking from now till the end of this year, how often will you be working remotely? We'll give everybody a moment to answer that question, and then we'll show the results.
Yeah, Jocelyn, this is a really timely question. Most of the participants here are from Quebec and Ontario, and Ontario just went into a lockdown, not a lock, further restrictions today and last week for Quebec. So I'm interested to see what pops up.
Yeah, that is a great point. I guess if we redid this poll, we can do it as kind of, are you staying home by choice or by force? Because that's a really good point. I think this time last year, I think we were all, once we started in the pandemic, I think all of us were kind of, let's stay at home, but maybe it'll be short term. Now you're absolutely right. Depending on where you sit in the world, the rules and regulations really differ.
Right, and everybody has about just under 10 seconds to be able to respond, so we can capture your results. All right, looks like we are ready for the results, and here they come.
Yeah, so almost every day, well over half of people will be working remotely every day, at least for the foreseeable future. I will say, I obviously I sit in the States. I think that in a lot of cities, we would see these exact same results. Even in places where it's not required to stay home and work fully remote, I think a lot of people are still choosing to do that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here as we go along. I see there are a couple of people who say rarely or only occasionally. And that's been a kind of interesting difference too, right? Some people have been working in the office or in their physical space of work this entire time as we've gone through this. Essential workers, not just healthcare, but as a great example, my father-in-law runs a shop that does maintenance on semis, and at the very beginning of the pandemic it was realized that shops like that could not shut down. My father-in-law works on refrigerated trucks. They're critical to the food supply, and so even though you might not think, oh, a semi maintenance manager is an essential worker, sure enough, he is. He's always had to be kind of going in and keeping the shop open. So we know that this is becoming a lot more prevalent, right? Both because of the pandemic and also because if you look pre-pandemic, a lot of people actually wanted to work remote. If we look back pre-pandemic, you can kind of see these diverse opinions on remote work. The quote that you see on the screen here: to become the absolute best place to work, communication and collaboration will be important, so we need to be working side by side. That was a statement made by the former Yahoo CEO. So years ago in 2013, when Marissa Mayer was CEO of Yahoo, she called everyone back to work, back to the physical office. She ended their remote working policies. And this was why she felt that in order to communicate, collaborate, innovate, in order to compete in the tech space that they were in and the the place in the market where they sat at the time, she said, we all have to get back to being side by side. And there was research to support that, right? That collaboration leads to innovation. And so it's not that this was, some radical idea. I think intuitively a lot of people saw the point of that move. But then if you look a little bit further into the research, if you take it from the employee perspective rather than the organization's perspective, one of the things that we find is that people who work remotely, the employees, the individuals doing it, are more likely to be engaged, enthusiastic, and committed to their work. So this was a survey that was done in 2017, so well pre-pandemic, and I think it's important at this point to always make that distinction. But the survey really found that remote work led to these positive individual outcomes, which then, of course, we know lead to positive organizational outcomes, right? Employees who are more engaged are more productive. Employees who show a higher level of commitment are more likely or more easily retained. But I want to put a really important caveat on this because it's something that I think is so fascinating about our current situation. When this survey was done, and what subsequent surveys have continued to show, is that when people say they want to work remote, often what they're actually saying is they want a hybrid remote work model. They want to be in the office, but only sometimes, maybe 1 day a week, 2 days a week, and then spending the rest of their time at home. And so in 2019, Buffer does this survey every year on remote work. Excuse me. And in 2019, 99% of people desired remote work some of the time. They said, I expect that I will want to work remote some of the time at some point in my career. And when we look to the same survey in 2020, after the effects of the pandemic, we say that that number hasn't really changed. It was like 98% said that they desired remote work. But if we dig into that, what you see on the screen here for fall of 2020, this is from an IBM report. Once they really started digging into that and asking people, they found that 35% of people in this IBM survey said, you know what, I want to go back to the office. 35% said, hey, I want to continue working remotely. And then the other 30%, that was a little bit of a nuance. They said, I want to continue working remotely, but only because I'm concerned about coronavirus. My primary motivation for working remotely is the coronavirus and the risk there. So that's where that other 30% falls.
Hey, Justin, just before you move off to the next slide, I've got a couple of questions that have come in and I'm hoping that you can answer. The first one is, will you be discussing the choice of remote and external stress related situations? Ideally kind of the pandemic. Yep. Okay,
Yes,
perfect.
yeah.
That was a quick answer. And the second one being, are we considering remote work at face value regardless of the family or living conditions? Are the family children taken into consideration? For example, even if remote work has a positive outcomes, having young children at home can hinder that.
So that is a great point, and thank you to whoever asked the question, because it's a perfect segue into my next point, which is that one of the reasons we think we're seeing this shift in attitudes, this shift from yes, I want to work remote to I don't know, maybe I want to be in the office at least some of the time. I definitely want to be in the office. One of the reasons that we think we're seeing that shift is the changing nature of remote work, and I'm a testament to this. I've worked remote for 8 years now. So pre-pandemic, I worked from home when I wasn't traveling. I'm a consultant, so I travel about 35-40% of the time. But other than that, I worked from home. But that was a wildly different experience than working from home now, right? When you could very well have found me in this picture on the screen circa 2018, because I had the option to go to some nice shared workspaces in Indianapolis where I live. I had the option to go to a coffee shop. If I wanted to be at home, my two toddlers were not likely to be in the house with me, right? They were off doing their kind of daily routines, living their daily schedules. Now remote work is truly work from home. And so now what we're seeing is that part of the reason that people's attitudes towards remote work are changing is because we think that the very nature of remote work is changing, right? It's not, now when I'm sitting on a call, it's very likely that if I forget to lock my door, I'm going to have a 3-year-old bandit coming in at some point to demand something from me because he's at home now too, right? He doesn't have any place to go. He doesn't have his old schedule either. So we do think that there is this impact of just the changing nature of remote work. Gone are the days of sitting in a coffee shop and working for hours or sitting in the quiet of your house. Now, work is all wrapped up with partners, kids, pets, home demands, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to, kind of extricate those things from one another. And so the other thing that we want to think about when we think about remote work and why this hybrid model really is probably the ideal state is just the value of shared space. This is something that we really always looked at when we thought about remote work, but it's something that we're thinking about even more now, I think, with the pandemic, because organizations now are faced with a choice. Will let's all hope that by the end of 2021, we'll be looking at something resembling normal, once vaccines are rolled out and treatments continue to improve, et cetera. At that point, then organizations are going to be left with a choice. Do we bring these people all back to work? Or do we let them stay remote? Or do we do some kind of hybrid model of that? And what drives that choice? And so, one of the things that organizations continue to look at is, well, what is the value of shared space? And there is real value there, both when we ask organizations and when we ask employees, what's hard about working remote? What is it that you lose when you're not in that same physical space? Companies and individuals will point out things like communication happens in a more informal, organic manner, right? If I have a question and I'm sitting next to someone, it's very easy to say, hey, what's the answer to my question? It takes a little bit more time, more effort, and more management of my own impression on the person to type that out in an email or to ping them via IM, right? Another thing that we look at, and this is really true as we, just continue to build a global environment and a global economy, is that for many people, particularly those who relocate for work, the workplace is not just a workplace. It's a place to fulfill your social needs as well, right? We at Hogan have been very fortunate to hire some young talent and move them to our Tulsa, Oklahoma headquarter office. But Tulsa, Oklahoma is not New York City. It's not Toronto. It's not a huge metropolis where you can meet lots of people and do lots of things. And so for our folks who have moved there for work, it's been really helpful to have the social connection of the office, to meet people, go out to lunch, go out after work for drinks or dinner or whatever it is. And then finally, and this is something that I think all of us probably can relate to, what we have discovered in the time of the pandemic is that video meetings and technology, no matter how good, just cannot replace natural conversations, face to face interactions. The research that's looking at this, one of the things that I came across as I was prepping for our conversation today, there's an indication that conversations that happen in real time in a face-to-face environment tend to be smaller and they tend to be more engaging. And so what we're finding with video meetings is that even though the technology is good, it's harder to get people to fully engage in those meetings. And also, if it's a larger group in a video setting, there's a real risk of a few extroverts in that group doing all of the talking, and just kind of running the conversation. In a video setting, it's much easier for the introverts to just kind of stay on mute, maybe not along, but not give their input. Whereas in a real time physical space, you can be looking for those nonverbals, you can be reaching out, in a very real way to engage them more in the conversation. So what's the current reality of remote work? You know, when I first started looking into this topic, when I first started thinking about it and talking about it and writing about it was actually last April. So we were in our very early days in the pandemic. At least in the States, we were still talking about flattening the curve. We were not talking about long-term effects and shutdowns and all of those kinds of things. Um, so of course, when I signed on to present with DTech, I said, okay, well, I need to relook at this, right? My research is old in terms of what's happening with remote work. So what do we know now? We know that for a lot of organizations and individuals, remote work is just here to stay. Prior to the pandemic, and these I believe it was a US based survey. Prior to the pandemic, the finding was that 7% of people work remote. Now, a survey of large companies, it was 681 global companies. Of those 681, the estimate was 25 to 35% of their organizations will stay remote. So we're likely to see an increase in remote work, even if the pandemic, and hopefully it does, even if it becomes a thing completely of the past, the value of remote work to both employees and organizations has been realized. And so we're likely to see it be more prevalent into the future. Leaders have to really rethink how they are engaging and supporting their teams. And that's from a very management focus, right? How do I know what you're doing? How do I communicate my expectations? How do I monitor your work so I can provide support? But it's also from a more leadership focus. How do I engage you? How do I motivate you? How do I foster commitment to me, to my team, to my organization if I'm never bringing you into a space where we can be together and have these real-time interactions? And then the other thing is we have to think about, well, how can employees be more effective, right? How can each individual be more effective? And that's really going to be our focus for today, is that kind of last piece. So we're going to jump into the competencies and characteristics that are related to this last piece of being effective in a remote environment. But before we do, let's take a break because I know we've had some questions coming in on Q&A. So let's do some chatting through those questions and then we'll go on.
Wonderful. Jocelyn, one of the questions I have here is there any research that you've seen that speaks to an ideal number of, conference calls or, or video chats with the intention of meaningful conversation, right? Really kind of being able to put that together.
So I don't know that I've seen a recommendation on the frequency or the number, but the recommendation I have seen is that those meetings do have to be purposeful, intentional. If you're going to, even when you schedule an in-person meeting, you want to make sure it's valuable for everyone, right? You want to make sure that everybody feels like this is a good use of my time. It's looking like that's even more important when it comes to video meetings because people are kind of getting over Zoomed. And so I do think if you're going to schedule a video meeting, really think about what needs to happen here. What's my purpose? What am I trying to do? What's it going to look like when we're in the meeting? What's my agenda? And what's the payoff? What's the payoff for me, the person who's calling this meeting? But how can I make sure I'm creating a valuable payoff for all of the participants? The one more concrete recommendation I saw was to keep meetings to a small number. I saw one person that recommended as little as 4 people in a meeting, in a video meeting, because they said beyond 4, you're going to start having situations where not everyone's engaged, not everyone's talking. So I don't know if I would go that low. I mean, sometimes you need more than 4 people in a room, but that's the other advice I would give. Just make sure that everyone who's in that room is clearly there for a purpose, right? They either are responsible for something, they're accountable for something, or they need to be consulted on something. If they just need to be informed, that's probably something that can happen outside of the video meeting.
Thanks. So one of the questions that kind of came up is around, and I know we're going to start talking about personality right after this, but just a final question before we kind of get into there is, do you see personality characteristics or certain personalities, take on Zoom fatigue more than others?
We are going to get into this. So hold that thought, but the answer is yes. And really what it comes down to, I don't know that it is specific to video meetings. I think really what it comes down to is on a personality basis, some people take energy from other people. They are energized by interacting with others. Some people, even if they're very good at communicating, collaborating, interacting, those activities decrease their energy. Just naturally, they need time alone to re-energize. And so for those people, the over zooming is a much bigger risk, right? Because you're wearing them out. Every time you are scheduling a Zoom meeting with them, you're asking them to dedicate energy that they then have to find a way to replenish later on.
And just in closing, before we kind of kick off the other side, the data that's being shared is American, I assume.
So some of the surveys I've mentioned were US based, but actually, no, most of the surveys I've mentioned were global. And then the data that we talk about in terms of competencies and characteristics is global. So Hogan's Data Archive, certainly we've done more research in the US and North America, US and Canada and the UK really too, than elsewhere, just because of who we are and where our distributors sit and where our partners sit, things like that. But our database is global. So what you'll be seeing in terms of competencies, characteristics, that's based on our global norm and our global data set.
Perfect.
So let's keep going. And I want to do just a quick poll using the chat feature. So if you are a Zoom newbie, or maybe you're a Zoom lover who's just been itching to chat us something, now's your chance. If you open up the chat feature, what I thought we would do is, as we move into this next section of the conversation, is just give me one competency or characteristic that you think is critical to remote work. So if somebody came up to you and said, hey, I have to start working remote, what do you think is one thing that will help me be successful? What's the one competency or characteristic that you would say might be critical to effectiveness in a remote environment?
I've seen self-discipline come in. Oh, wow. There's empathy, focus, willingness to reach out for support, collaboration, independence. Again,
Yeah, lots of
flexible,
focus on being independent, self-monitoring, self-managing. Yeah.
discipline, accountability,
Mhm.
self-motivated, adaption, autonomous.
Yeah, autonomous. Yeah, adaptable,
Okay. Yep.
organized. Yep, absolutely. So, I may have set myself up for to let you guys steal my thunder because you're really honing in on the exact competencies that our research indicates is critical to remote work. So when we look at our research, and I'm going to just skip through this slide quickly. I'll come right back to it. So when we look at our research on the competencies that are important, we find a lot of what you guys hit on. So the idea of self-management, can you demonstrate self-control? Can you stay motivated and productive even without other people around telling you to be motivated, be productive? Communication, kind of self-explanatory there, communicating with others, being willing to, and doing so in a way that feels rewarding and productive to other people. Dependability, absolutely, right? If you're going to be working remote and I can't see you and I can't tap you on the shoulder, then I want to know that you're doing what you are supposed to be doing, what you said you were going to do, yet, right? You're following through on the commitments that you've made to me. But on the other side of that, with flexibility, I don't want you to be too rigid, right? We find that people who are successful in a remote environment are able to change directions, again, without necessarily being told to. They're able to look at the situation and say, what do I need to adapt? Where do I need to reprioritize without a boss or a coworker sitting next to them helping them make those decisions? And then the final competency that we find in our research as being particularly important is relationship building. Relationship building is a little bit different than communication because here the focus is really on being proactive. Some people build relationships by reacting to others. You go to them and you say, hey, can you help me out? And they say, yeah, I'm happy to help. And that sets the foundation of your relationship with that person going forward. Other people are naturally more proactive. They build the bridge. They reach out to you and say, hey, it looked like you need help. Do you need help? And that's the foundation. So when we differentiate communication and relationship building, because with this relationship building piece in terms of remote work, there really is a focus on being proactive, being very collaborative in your relationships and how you build them. So now that we've looked at the competencies, let's break it down into some of the characteristics that relate to these competencies. So anytime that we're talking about, anytime you talk to people from Hogan, you will hear us talk about personality in three kind of distinct ways. So there are three Hogan assessments. They all measure personality-based characteristics. We just measure them in slightly different ways. So the motives, values, preferences inventory is a measure of core values. That's really what's motivating to you, what you're interested in. Our values impact the kind of environment in which we're a good fit. The Hogan Personality Inventory is day-to-day work style, essentially on a day-to-day basis. How do you approach your job? How are you likely to show up to others? And then the Hogan Development Survey is a measure of derailers. So here, instead of looking at day-to-day, we're looking at, well, when things go wrong, when you're under stress, when you're bored, when you stop self-monitoring, how do you get in your own way? What are the counterproductive tendencies that might emerge? So we'll go through each of our competencies, and as we go, we're going to talk about these day-to-day work style characteristics with the HPI and the derailers with the HDS that tend to impact remote effectiveness in a remote work environment. And just a little bit later, we'll revisit the MVPI. The values you won't see as much represented in the research, but we'll revisit it when we get into our practical tips and tricks. So if we look at self-management, excuse me, anytime that we're talking about competencies, we like to differentiate between the behavior that is indicative of that competency and then the characteristics that relate to or predict that behavior. So when we dig into the data, we look at self-management. Some of the behaviors that we see as kind of part of the definition of self-management in a remote work environment are building your own structure, right? You're not going to have somebody saying, here's what you need to do today, here's what you need to accomplish today. You have to do that on your own in a remote work environment. You have to prioritize kind of what you're doing, when you're doing it, how you're doing it. You have to manage that pace as well, right? It's not just that you won't be getting feedback from other people, but in an office, you're kind of getting informal feedback from the environment, right? You're hearing the buzz, you're seeing what's happening with different functions, and you can respond to that, right? You can kind of absorb that and respond to it. You won't have that in a remote work environment. And then really importantly, in a remote work environment, in a work from home environment, I'm sure many of us are experiencing this. It's really, it becomes much more important to define your work-life boundaries, right? There's not going to be anybody saying, oh, it's 5 o'clock. I see other people, leaving for the day. I'll pack up my stuff and leave too, right? You're not going to, as I mentioned, my toddler, if I was in an office, he wouldn't have the option of kind of coming into my workspace whenever he wanted to, but now I'm easily accessible, so I have to really create those physical boundaries between us.
Hey, Jocelyn, just to interrupt, some of the comments that that I always hear from people when we're working, and I work across many time zones, is that they don't work from home; they live at work.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. And just to kind of let everybody know, I've been getting a lot of questions. We will have this webinar available to you to be able to listen to, as well as be able to send out the slides to all that are here.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's a great point. That's one thing about this new remote work environment. I saw a thing where somebody was like, this was earlier on, maybe last summer, but I'm on a lot of mommy blogs. I have 2 young children, so I spend my time reading about how other people parent young children. And on some of the mommy blogs, people were saying, don't get it twisted. We're not working from home. We're taking care of our kids and trying to get some work done at the same time, right? So I do think that there is this idea of just, okay, we have to re-examine what's work, what's life, and how do those two things intersect? What's the boundary between? So when we look at personality, some of the personality characteristics that we find that are positively related to self-management, so the kinds of characteristics that will help a person demonstrate this competency are things like stress tolerance. In Hogan language, adjustment is stress tolerance and self-assuredness. People who are higher on adjustment, they just tend to be more tolerant of stress. They tend to show a higher level of resilience. And so when they're put in a situation where they have to manage their own time, challenges, setbacks, they tend to be more comfortable doing that. It takes less effort for them to do that. People who are higher on prudence, prudence is our conscientiousness scale. They're naturally more planful and organized in how they work. People who are lower on this particular characteristic, they tend to be more agile, but they can also be a little bit harder to predict. And so when it comes to this remote work environment, again, people can't see you, they can't see what you're doing. And so they need you to probably work in a way that says, okay, this person has a plan, they're working that plan, and they're going to get things done on time and to the appropriate standard or quality. With ambition, this is all about drive and taking initiative, right? People who are high on ambition, they tend to be described as self-starters, and they tend to feel comfortable in environments where there just isn't a lot of guidance or direction, right? They tend to be naturally goal-oriented, and so left on their own, they'll set a goal and work toward it. And that can be really helpful, again, in a remote work environment where you may be left alone a good part of the time. If we look at the opposite side of that, what are the characteristics that detract from
Sorry,
self-management or
just
that
just
might?
before you go into that,
Yeah.
Justin, before you go to the HDS, so would you say kind of high adjustment, high prudence are predictors of performance in a remote environment?
I think that they are predictors of this particular competency in a
Yeah.
remote environment. If we looked at overall performance, I think that you would still see those relationships, based on what I know about our research, which is a lot. I think you would still see those relationships, but I don't have that data in front of me. In this case, we looked at it by performance ratings on competency versus overall performance ratings. So
Perfect.
if we,
Sorry, go ahead. That was it.
yeah. So if we look at the HDS scale, some of the derailers that might detract from this competency, we see excitable and skeptical. Essentially, people who are excitable have a hard time managing their emotions under stress. People who are skeptical have a hard time remaining open and transparent with others when they're under stress or feeling insecure or they derail, in those tough moments, in those trying times. And so it kind of goes back to this idea of, managing your pace, defining your boundaries, managing yourself. People who are higher on excitable and skeptical can be seen in a more negative light in this area because when they're under stress, they seem more reactive. They seem more closed off. People aren't seeing that positive, resilient, open attitude that they want to see.
So, Jocelyn, just because before you move into the next slide, I have a question. As a manager responsible for a remote team, how can I make sure employees don't expand their boundaries beyond what is being asked and expose themselves to mental strain?
So, it is such a good question, and I think it's something that is really important to think about. I don't know that I have the answer, but I will say this. In my literature review prior to this webinar, the one of the surveys that I mentioned found that one of the questions on the survey, they ask employees, do you feel well supported and trained in this new remote work environment? And they ask managers and leaders, do you think your employees feel well supported and well trained in this new work environment? something like 80% of managers said, yes, we are supporting and training our people appropriately in this new normal. It was less than 50% of the employees surveyed that said, yes, I feel appropriately supported and trained.
Hmm.
So I think the first thing for leaders to remember is that if you think your people are doing okay, they might not be doing okay, right? You might really have to think about, how am I touching base with them? How am I connecting with them? What specific questions am I asking them to ascertain their wellness, their bandwidth, their engagement? It's probably not enough anymore to say, hey, how's it going? You might have to get much more specific. How's it going in this area with this team, with this project? What's happening outside of that? Are there stretch goals? Are you participating in cross-functional teams? I think being much more intentional and even more detail oriented in how you communicate with employees might help to bridge that gap a little bit.
Do you think being more detailed oriented or kind of more precise with the conversations to make sure that they're on board may come across possibly as micromanagement?
It could. I think it's a great point, and that's why I say I think you have to ask about. It has to be less of what are you doing, right now to achieve goals, and I think more of a paint a picture for me of how you are doing in each of these areas, right? How do you think it's going in terms of communication between me and you, between you and your teammates? How do you think it's going in terms of time management? Do you feel like you're being over meetinged? Is there something that we can think about doing so that you feel like your prioritization or your time is being used more efficiently? So I think coming at it from that very supportive standpoint versus let me check off the tasks that you're working on could help.
Right. Perfect. Thank you.
And it's really, we're talking about employees today, but leaders have to think about this stuff too, right? Some leaders are very command and control style leaders. Having a virtual team might be harder for them, naturally more uncomfortable for them than leaders who are more collaborative, empowering, a little bit more hands off, right? The virtual environment might not cause them any heartburn. And so it's both about, today we're talking about what employees can do, but we could have another whole webinar on what leaders could do, because there are things to think about there as well, for sure.
That's
So
very
if we keep
insightful. Thank you.
Yeah, so if we keep going through our competencies when it comes to communication, in the remote work environment, what we're finding is that it is critical to communicate proactively and purposefully. So again, reach out, pick up the phone, ping the person on IM, be proactive about it. Think about the payoff, both for you and the other person. What's the purpose of this conversation? What's the payoff for everybody involved? And then also really think about how you can build trust through conversations. Again, coming at things from a supportive kind of standpoint, really seeking input. I loved that someone mentioned in the chat active listening as a competency that's critical, because I do think that that becomes more critical. It's really easy to get on a video call and have a quick business conversation, right? It's more difficult to get on a video call and build a relationship through that conversation. But our research indicates that that's a critical part of it when it comes to working remote. You use conversation and collaboration to get things done, but you also have to use it to build that trust. So when we look then at the characteristics that relate to it, so the ambition and the sociability here, this is really about the proactive piece, right? Are you driven to go out and talk to other people to get things done? That's the ambition. Sociability is, are you comfortable talking to other people? Do you want to go out and talk to other people? Or are you kind of more independent on the lower side of sociability? Interpersonal sensitivity, this is really where that trust piece comes in. People who are higher on interpersonal sensitivity tend to be naturally more considerate and sensitive to others. And so when you're communicating with them, it can very much feel like this person is friendly, is warm. I can trust them to be benevolent and have my best interest at heart. When we look at the detractors, we see cautious and reserved. Here, this is really cautious is really about lacking that proactivity. People who are higher on cautious are just a little bit more hesitant to take initiative to build those bridges. And then reserved, people who are high on reserved, when they're under stress, they just become more independent and introverted, and it can be harder for them to maintain frequent, meaningful communications with others because they just might have more of a tendency to want to go and close the door and be on their own when they're working through those tough times. If we keep going and look at dependability, and you'll start to see some of these things come up again, right? So if we think about dependability, it's really about, can you be trusted to complete your own tasks? So kind of similar to self-management, right? Can you create a structure? Can you manage your pace in order to get things done on time and in the right way? And then also, are you driven to keep other people in the loop? Do other people know where you are, right? We all have met those people that are kind of natural change agents. They're natural mavericks. They are willing to just charge off into the woods on their own to pursue, the next idea or the next initiative. In a remote work environment, those people are even harder to pin down, right? You don't know where they are. You don't know what they're working on. And so it's important in this environment to really build a reputation of being predictable, being dependable. For people who are naturally higher on adjustment and higher on prudence, this comes more easily, right? They're naturally more perseverant, more resilient under stress, and they also just tend to want to work in an organized, planful manner. People who are lower on adjustment and prudence tend to be more reactive. They tend to be a little bit more, fly by the seat of their pants, a little bit more fluid or dynamic in how they work. From the HDS perspective, excuse me, imaginative, mischievous, and colorful, they're really all about focus. People who are higher on these scales tend to embrace ideas with imaginative, risk with mischievous, and a lot of social engagement with colorful. And when you put them together, it can lead to a seeming lack of focus or lack of credibility. And so, again, this goes back to building that reputation of, hey, even if it seems like I'm making some big, bold moves, pursuing some big ideas, I'm still getting done what I need to get done. I'm still fulfilling my charter and the core responsibilities of my work.
Jocelyn, we just had a question come in. While high sociability scores might be effective communicators, is there data showing that they would find it harder to be away from the office or miss the interaction of in-person contact? And if so, what is the impact on their performance?
So I don't know. I don't have data on the impact on performance, but I think that you are absolutely right that even if they are able to perform as well, people who are high sociability may find it more difficult to stay motivated in a remote environment. This is something that's really interesting. I mentioned that we were going to touch on the values, but just briefly, what we tend to find, so when we did this research, we were looking at performance. So if we look at ratings of communication, people who are higher sociability have higher ratings on communication. But if we ask those people who are high sociability, hey, do you feel less motivated now that you're in a remote environment? They might very well say, yes, I feel less motivated. And it's because of that. It's because people who are high sociability take energy from others. People who are low sociability tend to be a little bit more intrinsically motivated. They don't need other people around them to stay energized. So it's a great distinction because the relationships that we're talking about here are personality and performance. They're not personality and motivation or personality and engagement from the individual perspective.
Just another question before you move on. Being that Hogan is so context based, does the context of remote work play an integral role in debriefing results? Versus the context of the organization itself. For instance, if an organization has a high social culture, but now you work at home.
Yeah, I think it's both. If you're when you're thinking about either for yourself or people you're coaching or people you're leading, kind of what does this all mean? I think you have to look at context now from more angles. You have to look at it from more layers, right? So we've always been thinking about what's your job context, what's the culture of your organization, but now we have to think more about what's the context of your physical environment. And that's just a conversation that we didn't used to have. I never used to say to people, hey, do you work remote? When I was coaching them, that might come up in conversation, but it wasn't a specific question. Now I think it is part of the conversation that we have to be having. What is that physical environment? Is it you trying to homeschool two teenage kids? Is it you with your spouse across the desk and you're both trying to take phone calls? What does that look like for you specifically?
Thank you. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no. Great questions. Thank you so much. It's always better when people are asking questions. That way you don't have to listen to me just go on and on. And I'm high sociability, so I would go on and on if you let me. So if we look at flexibility, it's so funny because it's one of those things where we want people to be everything, right? And the remote work environment is no different. So we say on the one hand, we want you to be really dependable. We want you to be really predictable, but don't be too rigid. We also want you to be agile. We also want you to be flexible, right? So with the flexibility piece, what this is really about is just kind of a quick adaptation in a remote work environment, and particularly the remote work environment that we're in now, where the pandemic is impacting the economy and the future state of business. There's, things happening from a geopolitical standpoint that are impacting the economy and the future of business. So when we think about flexibility in this current environment, we're really thinking about, can you adapt when you need to? If something changes, if a process changes, if policy changes, if the organization all of a sudden needs to be doing something differently, can you adapt to that? And then also just looking for a willingness to learn new tools and technology. Certainly in our business, this is something that we're grappling with, right? How do you continue to train and develop talent in a virtual environment? And to some extent, it just is probably true that those people who are naturally more driven with ambition, who are naturally more self-assured and are able to just persevere through the challenge and the setbacks more easily, those are the people who are likely to say, hey, I need to learn something, so I'm going to take the initiative to learn it, right? And then from the standpoint of detracting, again, we see this excitable here, right? And that just goes back to, can you get past the setbacks? Can you adapt to the change, or is it the kind of thing that just really throws you off your game? And then finally, with relationship building, again, pretty close to communication, right? But here it's more about, how do I start that? How do I initiate that relationship? Communication, I think, is more about maintaining the relationships over time. And what we see here is that increased, that higher interpersonal sensitivity, right? It's from a remote environment, when you're building relationships, you have to make sure that you are behaving in a way that people want to build a relationship with you, that they want to talk to you. I think that's why the interpersonal sensitivity comes up. People who are higher on this scale are just naturally seen as more agreeable, friendlier. So if you're lower on this scale, if you tend to be a pretty blunt, no nonsense, suffer no fools kind of person, there's a real strength to that. But then you have to think about, how am I making sure that people know that I care about them, that I want to hear about their day and how it's going, their pets, their kids, whatever's happening in their life. You just might have to make that more conscious effort if you're lower on interpersonal sensitivity to show that kind of personal connection. And then excitable comes up again. Excitable really becomes an Achilles heel in a remote work environment, I think, because people who are high excitable, they behave in these kind of temperamental ways, or they appear to lack resilience. And when you're in a physical environment with somebody, you can kind of quickly say, oh, I'm sorry, I lost my cool, or, oh, I wish that it hadn't gone that way. You can't really do that in a virtual environment, right? You can't build up that social capital and that grace with other people. So I know we're running short of time, and it's all for a good reason, because you all have had great questions and participation. I want to just kind of sum up some of what we've been talking about. So when we look at the bright side characteristics, it's really about, on a day-to-day basis, Are you behaving in a manner that is seen as reliable, conscientiousness, friendly and considerate? Do other people look at you and say, yes, that person can handle the stress, they can put out the fires and they'll be okay? And then can you just self-start? Can you just keep yourself going without other people around keeping you going? From the dark side, the derailers, what we're looking for here is people who are seen as particularly volatile and temperamental, people who are seen as kind of timid and lacking initiative, and people who are seen as just overly independent or disconnected. Those tend to be the ones that suffer more in that remote environment. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip through some of my tips for success. I will say, just to a question that came up earlier, at the beginning of all of this, I think we were all living on humor and memes. And so there were some kind of great memes that came out, and this was one of my favorite ones. So, company says work remotely due to coronavirus. Introverts rejoice, and extroverts, kind of bite their nails with concern. So I do think that there's a lot of wisdom in just realizing that some people are going to really like this environment. Some people are going to find it more unpleasant and difficult. And in any case, there are things that you can do, right? So I'm going to skip through these, but you will get the deck. So if you want to kind of review some of my suggested tips and tricks, you certainly can. In the interest of time, though, I do just want to share a little bit more that I found in the research. So if you get easily motion sick, look away, because I'm about to scroll through a lot of stuff. Something that I found in the research, when it comes to this remote work, we're all in this together, right? We're all doing it to a certain extent. We expect to keep doing it to a certain extent. We might be forced to do it, at least for the short term, but we can help one another to be effective. So that's another thing to think about. We talked about individual employees today. Certainly we could talk about leaders, but we could also just talk about how teams and peers and teammates can work together to help one another adapt and be effective, because we're all struggling in the same ways, right? 20% of people say that collaboration and communication is hard, that loneliness is a struggle. 18% of people say, hey, I'm having issues with work-life boundaries. So we are going through this together. We can help one another. And it's not all bad news. Again, we expect to see remote work continue. And it's because there are benefits both to organizations from a cost-saving perspective, an overhead perspective on your physical space, but also on employees who feel that they now can be more flexible, that they can, attend to their kids more readily, or spend more time with their partner or their pets because they're not commuting as much. So we've got about 5 minutes left, and I'm going to end us there so that we can spend our last few minutes on any questions that you all have.
And I do have a few for you. One of them is, from a hiring perspective, are there any considerations to be taken into account for remote work versus in the office, i.e., if a candidate shows promise for a remote work environment versus in office or vice versa, how do we take this into consideration for the longer term?
I think that the first thing you have to do is just give a very realistic job preview. So if you have someone coming in and they're going to work remote, and through the Hogan assessments that you're using or through other selection tools that you're using that this person is highly sociable, is really motivated by collaboration, I think you want to talk to them about, hey, this is what your environment is going to look like. And it will be, on you to create collaboration, to create communication. And we want to make sure that you're going to be a good fit for that environment, that you're not going to feel something's lacking. So I feel like that realistic job preview is always really important. I think that particularly with leaders, it is going to be important to just kind of start asking, how do you lead virtual teams? Where have you done this in the past? And then I would think about it from onboarding and coaching too, right? If you see someone who's struggling in that remote environment after you bring them on board, you want to retain them, you want to capitalize on their talent, think about how you can help them. Be talking to them about what's fulfilling to you. Maybe, some special projects we could give you, a cross-functional team you might serve on, to just keep them engaged if they seem to be struggling.
That's great. In addition to changing the ways we communicate and collaborate, it seems like the remote environment could impact how people seek and receive feedback at work. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think that this is so interesting. So I don't like conflict. I don't like giving negative feedback. And I feel bad for every manager in the world that now has to do that in a video environment, because I can just, that just can seem awkward. So I would recommend that you recognize that a lot of the informal feedback that people get from the environment, from their peers, from just being in that workspace is now completely absent. And so you might really need to think more about giving that kind of real-time feedback in an informal way. Don't wait for the performance review. Even if it's done quarterly, that's 3 months of time where in 2018 the person was getting kind of constant feedback from their environment, and now they're getting none. So I think that I think that really that focus on continuous check-in, informal feedback, a real-time organic conversation that happens between leader and employee becomes very important in this remote environment. It makes sure that your employee is hearing what they need to hear. It gives them a chance to tell you what you need to hear, and it does so in a way that reduces the just kind of natural awkwardness of video plus performance review combined.
All right, and again, I've got some great other questions here, and I know in the interest of time, we only have this hour investment from everybody that wanted to stay on. But we will send this presentation out to everybody. If anybody has any questions at any point, we'll make sure that there's either my contact or another contact available to you to be able to answer any other questions. Just to wrap it up, I'm going to give you one more, and this is really interesting, and it's come across a couple of times. But early on, I can see how the new normal is being harder for earlier career folks who haven't had a chance to prove themselves at work. What are some of the ways that people can increase their visibility within their companies in a remote environment? I know so many people that started a month before the pandemic, and they barely have a relationship with their manager, and then they were forced to remote work.
Yeah, I agree with this. I think this is something that onboarding is just going to take on a whole new meaning, right? I think that it's really critical that leaders and employees be thinking about, what are my opportunities? So I have a job, I have to think about my job, but what are my other opportunities to be involved, right? Is there some kind of crew that's putting together virtual happy hours? Maybe I can get in on that. Is there a special project? Do I have some expertise that I want to write about? I think it's just, as an employee, as an individual, it's just making sure that that is known. Don't expect people to see it or pick up on it. Remind yourself that you have to really explicitly communicate it and be proactive. That's my best advice. It can feel awkward to pick up the phone or schedule the Zoom meeting, but if you have to do it, you have to do it. Just make sure you're telling people, hey, here's what's in it for you.
You know what? I know I said it was the last question, but I promise this is the very last one, because I found this one interesting. In a physical environment, one of the things that helps employees bond together is social activities, softball, bowling leagues, whatever it is. This being absent from remote work, what are some of, or are there any substitutes to be able to kind of meet that same goal outside of the work happy hour, which I don't know if that works.
You know what? I mean, I don't think there is a substitute. And so my best advice is offer people things like the work happy hour, but never make it mandatory.
Right.
Always make it optional, and try to diversify, right? Maybe, this is something we're doing at Hogan. We started with a virtual happy hour, and then we said, well, not everybody wants to get on and, play trivia, and that's okay. So then we did now we have something that we call learnings and libations, where it's still the idea of, at the end of the day, if you want, get your beverage of choice. But instead of trivia and talking, we're going to have somebody from research come in and present some interesting thought leadership, internally. So I think you can have those video-based interactions. My advice, though, is to make them diverse so that you're hitting on a lot of different people's interests, and then never make them mandatory, because for some people, they just don't want to sit on that video, and that's okay, right?
That's absolutely all right. Jocelyn, we appreciate your time. Thank you for everybody for sticking with us, even where we're well over time. Again, we will get this presentation and a link to where you can find the video so you can see this live. But thank you again. And if anybody's looking for how to find me, My information is on the screen. Feel free to reach out, and we'll answer any other questions you have. Thank you, Jocelyn.
Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.